Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on 4 useful condition value techniques. Today's presenter will be John, and my name is Barrett, and I'll be your host today. Now at this point, we have 2 polls for you. We find that launching these polls at the very beginning are really helpful to gauge our audience and our listeners. So the first poll is very simple. It's just asking if you're a current user. And while you're filling that out, I do want to give you some news and updates in our announcement section. So we do have Zerion Academy, which is now available, which uses an LMS, a learning management system. Some of you who've gone through certification or recertification already have access to Zerion Academy. And as time goes on, we'll give more and more of our active customers access to Zerion Academy so that they can follow along and partake in courses and as well as have all the training material that's ever been presented to them in one central location. So it's really exciting. Additionally, we have our Form Builder recertification, which will be the February 14th and 15th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. If you haven't signed up for that, we have the link in the PDF that we'll share with you after today's session. And at this point, I'm going to look at our poll results to see what it looks like our user base is. And John, it looks like almost everyone has responded, and everyone who has responded has said that yes, they are a current user. And now we have one more poll to launch, and while you're responding to this question, I'll go ahead and tell you about some of the other upcoming events that we have. So this poll is just asking what your experience has been as a form builder. So just for us to identify what, essentially, are you brand new, or if you've been building forms for a while, for us to gauge how you're going to appreciate or how you're going to understand the material that John's presenting. And again, as you're responding to this question, just quickly going over the upcoming webinars that we have. So next week, we have our first ever 3-part webinar series on February 14th, 15th, and 16th. This webinar series is called Building Solutions with Zerion. So for those of you who've been around our Zerion universe for a while, you know that we have some really awesome tools available, and this is actually diving under the hood and showing you how those tools can be used and accessed even if you don't have a Zerion account yet. Then on February 22nd, we have our training webinar on iForm Builder Essentials for project managers. So not only will that go into how to manage users and best practices, but also how to manage your data as a project manager. And then in early March, on the 2nd, we have an introduction to Zerion Identity Management, which is one of those great tools that we have in the Zerion platform. And at this point, John, we have almost everyone has voted on their experience as a form builder, and it looks like we don't have anyone who's brand new, but we have some individuals who are relatively new and just getting started, as well as the majority of our audience is comfortable, but they feel limited in building forms. So with that, John, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and give you your show back.
Thanks, Barrett, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for tuning into this webinar. I'm really excited to present to you today 4 useful condition value techniques. And judging by the poll results, I think that this is a very timely topic to have you all go through, especially if you feel like you're pretty comfortable in the platform, but you feel a little limited. Hopefully, some of these techniques are going to be applicable to your current projects, and you'll be able to incorporate them and then make your forms a little bit better. So to begin with, what I want to do is go over each one of the different techniques we're going to be going through today. After that, I'm going to do a real quick overview of smart controls as a whole. We'll dive into condition value a little bit more since that is the emphasis of today's topic. And then what I actually am planning on doing is building out every single one of the solutions for you all during the webinar. So if you're so inclined, you can either just listen in, or if you want, you may be able to follow along. I'm going to try to keep the pacing at a rate where we're able to keep on moving, but also if you are pretty comfortable with form building, you may be able to follow along and type out the different things that I'm doing and working with the form builder the way I'm doing so. Now, the 4 different techniques we're going to be going through today, the first one is going to be hiding in a filled element. So the idea here is after you fill in an element and you give it a value, that element is going to then be hidden from the form. This would be useful in a scenario where you don't want a user to be able to edit the field after they've put in information, or you may have a form that's very long and you want to start removing the visibility of certain elements from the form as the data collector goes through. This way it's a little bit easier for them to navigate through the form. The second technique is going to be adding an other option to both pick list and a multi-select. So for those of you who may not be familiar, pick list and multi-select are 2 elements that are option based, meaning you're going to create an option list, which is a predefined set of values, and you're going to attach that option list to that element. Now the primary difference here is a pick list, you're able to choose only a single option from the list, whereas with a multi-select element, you're able to choose multiple options. Basically, the way this will function is if one of the options, which is labeled as other, is chosen, then a text field will show underneath where the user is able to enter in whatever that value should be. The third technique is going to be showing elements only for specific users. So what I mean by that is when you build out a form, you may have certain users who are designated as admins or as managers, and there may be elements that you only want them to be able to see. For example, if you have a form where after they fill it in, they have to assign it to their supervisor, there may be an admin section where only the supervisor should have access to be able to edit those fields. I'm going to show you how you can do that. And then finally, the fourth condition value technique is going to be focused on manipulating and leveraging the length of a subform. So the idea here is after a subform reaches a certain length, in the scenario I've written out for you, that field is going to be hidden, so you can no longer add elements to it or no longer add records to it. So let me go ahead and move over to my device so I can show you how each one of these work. So this is a fully built out solution for everything that we're going to go over today. And again, afterwards, I'm going to go ahead and go through each one of them and build them for you as well. So this first technique at the top, I have this text field as first name. Once I enter in my value, you'll see the field is now not visible anymore. So I'm using the condition value to hide that field after the fact. The second technique, this top element is going to be a pick list. So if I were to choose an element that is a normal selection, I'm able to do that. But if I choose the other option, you'll now see a text field that shows underneath where I can then enter in the value of my other manufacturer. The same thing happens for a multi-select, where if I choose multiple options, because I chose other, this field will show up as well. If I were to deselect other, it is hidden. For this third technique, there's not much I can show you in terms of it being hidden because I'm logged in as a specific user and I don't have a second device to show the different comparisons, the comparative views. But just know that this element here, this admin only subform, has the condition value set where if I was not logged in as this specific user, it would not show. And then the final technique here is going to show the element based on the subform length. So once the subform reaches 3 records, and I'm just going to leave these blank for the sake of time, but after I've logged in 3 records to the subform, the element will then be hidden. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the length of the subform to set my condition values. Now, before I jump into building each one of them, I do want to do a very quick overview of what smart controls are. So smart controls are basically the name of the set of properties we use to do more advanced form manipulations. You're able to do things like pre-fill element fields, whether you're giving them a default value or a value that is calculated. You're able to restrict the visibility of fields, and that's going to be the condition values that we talk about. Restricting the visibility is going to lead into the capability of establishing what's called skip logic. And skip logic is a setup where certain fields are going to show based on the values of fields that were filled in earlier. So if you think about a traditional paper form where you may have a question that says, if yes, skip to part B, you can do a similar type of technique in an iForm or an iForm builder with your data collection, except that instead of having to skip, it'll just properly show the right fields and it'll hide the ones that shouldn't be filled in. The other aspect of smart controls is that you're able to reduce error and provide meaningful feedback to users. You can do this through the client validation and the validation message. Because that's not the focus of today's webinar, I'm not going to get too far into that. Similarly, with the lookup table, or what we also call a smart table search, you're able to look up a second form's records to pre-populate fields. But again, because that's not the focus, I'm not going to go too far into that. The last thing I do want to say from a high level is that all the smart controls are written using JavaScript. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, this should be a little bit easier for you to follow. If you're not, don't worry, because I'm going to be able to go through this at a speed where you should be able to pick up on what we're doing. I'll explain the syntax as I type through everything as well. Now to jump into condition values a little bit deeper, condition values are going to enable you as a form builder to have an element be hidden so it cannot be altered. That's similar to the first technique or the final technique where we hid the subform after it reached a certain length. And then you're also able to incorporate skip logic based on other form values. So that is going to be similar to that second technique with the other field. Now, a couple of tips and tricks, and these are really going to be condition value basics. The first one is that if you set the value to false inside of a condition value field, that is going to always hide the element. So the idea here is if the condition value, the statement evaluates to false, then the field is hidden. If it evaluates to true, then the field is shown. So that's your general basic paradigm for how a condition value works. The other tip and trick that I wanted to highlight, because we're going to be using it later, is to use the ZC display key for option-based functions or option-based functionalities. Now, jumping into the different techniques, I have them laid out here in this slide deck, which you will receive a copy of at the end of the webinar. Each one of these sections has details about all the different steps we're going to take, but I don't want this webinar to be focused on the presentation slides. I really want to get into the form builder and show you all how to build these out. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create my new form. And I'm just going to call this form webinar demo. Now just know that when you make your forms, if this based on label is checked on or it's enabled, the table name will emulate my form label. In this case, I'm going to just shorten the table name so it'll be easier to write my smart controls later on. And let me go ahead and create this form. Okay. Uh-oh. Barrett, I think I timed out, so let me go ahead and refresh this real quickly.
Not a problem. And while you're refreshing, there was one question that came in from someone who's relatively new to building forms.
Sure.
And they asked, in a simple sentence, how can I remember what conditional values are used for when I'm building my form? So condition value versus dynamic value.
Sure. As a single sentence, the easiest way to remember condition value is it is a condition that determines whether the element is shown or the element is hidden.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
No problem. So to start on this first technique, what we need to do is we need to add a text field or a text element that we're going to then control the visibility of. So I'm going to take my left-hand panel over here. I'm going to scroll down to find text. I'm going to click on this to add it. Now I'm going to set the label to something like first name. Now the label again is what is shown to the data collector on the device itself. Now for the name, I also call this a data column name sometimes. So if you hear that term, know that that's what I'm talking about here. I'm going to call this field something like first_name. Now know that the data column name has to be database friendly, meaning it does not allow any space characters. That's why I have this underscore here. Now, just to make sure everything works and we're all connected, I'm actually going to save this right away. I'm going to go ahead and come back over to my control panel and assign the form to my webinar user. And I just want to check to make sure that I can view the form and that this is all connected properly.
And if anyone is following along and they're building out their forms, just as you see, John is assigning this form to himself because he's logged in as a server admin in a dedicated database. If he wasn't logged in as a server admin and was building the form, then it would automatically be assigned to his device. So he wouldn't have to go through this step. And if you're not logged in as a server admin, you won't have to go through this step right now as well.
All right, so I went ahead and synced up my device after assigning it, and I have this first name field displaying on my form properly. And so here you'll see it on my home screen as well. This is the form label. And so that's what we'll be working off of for the rest of today. So now that I know that that's all connected, let's go ahead and start building out the smart controls to be able to have this field hidden once it's been filled in. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and figure out the length of this text field. So the idea being, if the text field is empty, it has a length of 0. Whereas if the text field has characters in it, then the length is obviously going to be greater than 0. Now to do this, what I'm going to add is I'm going to add a number element, and I'm just going to call this something like length check. And I'll make the data column name the same. And what I'm actually going to do is jump down here to the dynamic value. And I'm going to set the dynamic value equal to the length of the previous field. So I'm going to do this by using the data column name of the first field, first name, dot length. Let me go ahead and save this. Let me resync my device and we'll take a quick look. Now, I'm going to go through this process a good number of times where I'm saving and syncing and checking, because it's really important and it's a best practice that when you are creating your forms, you want to constantly check what you're doing to make sure that it's working properly. If you make a whole lot of changes at once and then you go to check your form and it doesn't work properly, it's really difficult to figure out where that error may be. So we'll see here that I put my first name in here, Jonathan, and you'll see the length is equal to 8. Now, if I go ahead and close this, you may have noticed this, I did this very quickly, but when I first opened the form, it showed an improper number. So for example, here, the first name is empty, but my length is equal to 8. So that's not correct. And what's happening is iForm is actually caching values from before, and it's going to be using those values if it doesn't have a value to check for to begin with. Now the way I get around that, and this is actually something I learned very recently, for my dynamic value, instead of referencing only the data column name, which I have right here, I'm actually going to append to this the name of my table or the name of my form, so that I have this structure here where I'm using the form name followed by the element's data column name and then the length property afterwards. So let me go ahead and save this, and then we'll check one more time.
And John, while you're syncing your device, I just looked at some of our attendees, and I know a good amount of them have been building forms for a while now and have run into that problem previously where it'll cache the response. So hopefully everyone noticed what you just did in the dynamic value, where you took the table name of the parent form and appended that. I think that's great.
Yeah, so I know that for myself, the way I normally went around that was for the fields that were being used in the smart controls, you would set a default value to them. The problem is sometimes you don't necessarily want a default value. You may want to leave that field empty. And so by using this technique of using the full structure, using the form name as well, it's a nice alternative to that prior technique. So you'll see here right now the first name is empty, the length is equal to 0. And if I fill this in, it gives me the length properly this time. Now, the last thing I do want to note here is if I were to do something like this where I just add spaces, it will count those as characters, and most likely this is not a value that you actually want as a proper input. And so we're going to add one more tweak to the dynamic value to prevent this from happening. Before we grab the length of the text field, what we're going to do is we're going to use the JavaScript trim function. And what the trim function is going to do is it's going to remove any white space from the beginning or from the end of my input. And so in this case where I have only white space, it's actually going to cut all of it out. And so this would actually register as being 0. Now, if you have, for example, a sentence and you have a white space in between two characters, the trim function is not going to remove that. It will only remove what's called leading or trailing white space. So that's white space that is before character input or after character input. Let me go ahead and save this. And we will resync one last time. Again, with a fresh form, we'll see that the length is 0. And if I add in some characters, it stays as being 0, which is what I want. So now if I do this, we're good. So now that we've properly captured the length of the text field, we can go ahead and set up our condition values. So the first thing I want to do is actually take this length check field and hide this field, because this isn't something that's going to be used by the data collector. So like I had mentioned earlier, for the condition value, I can set this to false, and now this element will always be hidden. The next thing I'm going to do is jump back up to my original text field, and I'm going to set my condition value to show as long as length check is equal to 0. So the idea here is if the length of my first name is 0, I want this field to show. As soon as the length is not equal to 0, meaning it has character input, because you can't have negative characters in the field, then the field will be hidden because length check will no longer equal 0, meaning this will evaluate to false. Let me go ahead and save this. And we'll do one more sync. And once I add in my name here, the field is hidden. So that functionality has been completely finished. The one thing I do want to note, though, is you always want to put yourself in the shoes of the data collector. That's actually one of the best practices that we advocate for during our Kickstart training programs and during a lot of these webinars where we're focused on training. We always like to remind form builders to think about the data collector and how they're interacting with the form. Now, if I was a data collector using this form and then all of a sudden my field vanished, that might worry me a little bit. I don't know if it's malfunctioning. I'm not sure if that's the way it's supposed to work. And so what we're actually going to do is we're going to take this a step further. We're going to focus on improving the experience of the end user, and we're going to change this text field to now be a read-only field after it's been filled in. So you're still going to get the same functionality where the data collector is no longer able to edit the field after it's been inputted, but it won't be a blank screen either. So for this read-only field, I'm going to set the dynamic value equal to first name. So this element will mimic the content of this element. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my condition value to have this only display if length check is greater than 0. So this is effectively the opposite of my text element. At the onset, length check is equal to 0, so this is shown, this is hidden. Once I get meaningful character inputs, then this will show, and this will be hidden. The last step I need to do is go ahead and make my label match properly, and I'll actually call this something like first name, read only. Let me go ahead and save this. And if all goes well, this will be the last sync for this first technique. Okay, so here I have my text field. I can fill it in. Once I click on done, you still see that input that I had. However, I can no longer edit this because it's a read-only field. And it's a very small and subtle difference, but if you notice at the far right of the screen, there's no there's no right arrow, meaning that you're unable to edit this field. So there is a small visual cue to differentiate between the read-only element and the text element. Barrett, were there any questions that came up during this technique that I could answer?
Hi, John. There were some questions. I answered most of them, but there was a request for you to revisit when you were talking about the spaces within your description and the steps that you had in here.
Sure. When you say spacing, do you mean the space between like the data column names, or are you talking about the white space in the element's input?
I wish I knew. I'll
Okay.
try to get some more clarification about that.
I'll go through both of them. It's not a big deal.
Sure.
So regarding the data column name, you'll see up here in my label, there is a space in the label, and that's fine. The label is what is shown outwardly to the data collector. So you want to be able to have spaces in there. You want to be able to do things like write a sentence or a set of instructions for the data collector. The data column name, on the other hand, is what is stored in the database table. It's actually the column heading. And so this must be database friendly, meaning it cannot have spaces in it. And so that's why I have an underscore here. Now, regarding the spacing in terms of the text field and what I was talking about with the trim function, I'm just going to utilize the space here in the description field here in this element. So if I have something like, if I have a sentence here or 2 words, right? This space in the middle is nested between, or it's surrounded by characters. There's a character to the left and a character to the right. So because of that, this is not considered white space that would be trimmed. Now, if I did something like this, again, this middle white space would not be removed, but this is what's called leading white space. So it's white space from the beginning of the line, and then it meets at a character. So this would be white space that could be trimmed. Similarly, if I have spaces at the end of the line, this could be trimmed also. And so if I have this original set of characters and I were to run the trim function, it would eventually be just this. So it takes out the white space in the beginning and the white space at the end, is how the trim function works. Were there any other questions, Barrett?
Let's see. I think we are okay right now. But I think right now would also be a great time for us to launch a poll to see what people were thinking about this technique.
Sounds good.
So if everyone could go ahead and respond to share with John how useful you think this technique will be for your upcoming projects that you're working on and future projects. All right, we almost have everyone responding, so that's great. And it looks like a large part of the audience thinks that it'll either be very useful or just a little bit useful. Okay. But no one is responding that they don't think it'll be useful at all. So that's really good to see.
That is.
And oh, sorry, but I was just going to say, and John, I'll hand it back to you. And if additional questions come in, then I will interrupt you.
Perfect. So from here, we can transition onto the second technique, which is going to be adding in that other field for our option-based elements. So to start this off, I'm going to create a pick list. We can name this something like manufacturer single, meaning that we're only going to choose one. I'm just going to call my data column name single. Now from here, the next thing I need to do with an option-based element is I need to go ahead and attach an option list to it. So I'm going to go down and choose my elevator manufacturers, which is this list here, and you'll see at the bottom I have this other option. Let me go ahead and assign this, and I will save this. Now, before I move forward, I do want to talk briefly about option lists. especially for those of us who are a little bit newer to form building. I want to make sure that we understand what I'm going to be doing in terms of manipulating the option list. So every option within an option list has three properties that you're able to access it by. And those are going to be your sort order, your label, and your key value. Now, with the screenshot I have above, imagine that the data column name was called rating. If I wanted to access the sort order or the index, I would just use the data column name. However, this can be a potential problem spot in your form building, because what's nice about the sort order is you're actually able to rearrange the display of the options. And so if you change the sort order, you've now effectively chosen a different or a different option if you were to use that index value. So we recommend trying to stay away from that if possible. I can also access the label using the ZC display value underscore followed by the data column name. And this will give you the text that the data collector sees, but there is a downside to this as well, and that would be that if you were to add localization to your option list, the label, the text is going to change. Meaning, again, if you use smart controls to build out your solutions with the label, those could be altered and messed up. The final choice we have here is to use the ZC display key rating property, and that is going to allow us to use what's called the key value. And the key value is going to be a unique value that's stored, again, in the database, and that's going to always be associated with that option. And so even if I rearrange this, even if I add localization to it, the key value will remain. So that's what we always recommend people use, is to try their best to use the key value whenever possible. Going back to my form builder, I've added my pick list here. And so now what I want to do is I'm going to add a text field, which will show only if I choose the value other. So I'm going to label this as enter manufacturer, and we'll call this pick list other. Now, the condition value for this pick list should be equal to the data column name for here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this. Let me just highlight it and copy it. ZC display key data column name. If this is equal to the word other, because this was the key value I had listed in my option list. And I will go back to it very quickly so you can see that. Inside my option list, scroll down here, this is the key value column, and you'll see it says other. Now just note that the key value in any of these comparisons is case sensitive, so you want to be careful with that. If this was uppercased, it would not work. So I'll make sure that the case matches properly. So once this is here, let me go ahead and save this. We'll jump back over to my device as I am syncing.
And I'm just going to interject quickly here, John.
Sure.
For those individuals who've been building forms for a while now, you're probably used to making use of the sort order number within this condition value statement instead of using the ZC display key. The reason we suggest changing your method and going this route is if you're down the road, if you change the order of the options in that option list, then your function no longer works. With this scenario, it'll work as long as that's still an option in your option list. All right, thanks, John.
No problem. So over here, let me go ahead and jump down to the second one with the manufacturer. If I choose Toshiba, for example, nothing shows up. If I choose other, this text field will now display, and I can go ahead and enter values into that if I want. So that's going to be how we access that one option in a pick list. And again, a pick list is going to be one of two option-based elements where you only choose a single value, the other one being a select element. And the select is going to be used if you have a smaller set of options. For this list of manufacturers, it's not really a super long list, but it's too much to show on the device in a single display. And so because of that, we chose a pick list. Now I'm going to do the same functionality, but with a multi-select this time. And so the syntax naturally is going to be slightly different. Let me go ahead and add my multi-select to this form. I can call this something like enter manufacturers, and I'll call this multi-select. Let me go ahead and attach the same option list to this element. And then I will add my text element underneath for my other choice. Multi-select other. Okay, let me go ahead and save this real quick. All right, this is also a good idea, by the way, just saving frequently. It's just like working with any other application, right, where you don't only want to save when you're done with your work, but it helps to save intermittently. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump down here to my condition value, and I'm going to set my condition value to something that's it's kind of similar to what I had before. I'm still going to be using the CC display key, multi-select. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, within this field, search for the word other. Okay. Now, let me talk about this briefly. The search function is going to look through the value that I had chosen, and if it finds the search query, which in this case is the word other in lowercase, it's going to return the position of that of the query. Now, if it doesn't find the match, then what it will do is it will return a value of -1. That second part is really important because that means if I get -1 back, it did not find the word other in the selection that I made. So from here, let me go ahead and save this. Let's go back here. Let's resync. And then we'll take a look at our multi-select. So down here, oh, you know what? I think I applied it to the wrong element. Oh no, this is okay. Oh, this is what I did. I named this incorrectly, so it looks weird. Oops. Let's call this here we go. My mistake. So we should actually be okay here. So this is my multi-select. If I choose other as one of the selections, you'll see my text field shows up. Okay. If I take it off, that one will be hidden. And so again, just to go over that confusion I had earlier, there was nothing wrong with my smart controls or my condition value. It was actually just the label for the element. I had labeled this as enter manufacturer instead of denoting it being the multi-select. And so I just wanted to clear that up to make sure I didn't lose anyone as I kind of shuffled through that right there. Barrett, are there any questions about this technique?
Not yet. Would you like me to launch the poll?
Yes, that would be great.
All right, there were lots of questions coming in, but I've been responding to some of them. And the last one that I was responding to, if you'd like to answer it, that's great. I'm also sending over the text response. But someone is just concerned about changing the sort order of options in an option list. So once you've collected data using that one option list, and that option list had been in order, and now you want to add a new option to that list, and you change that sort order, how will that impact the data?
That's a really good question, and I can understand the concern. The data actually is not going to be altered because the key value is what is going to be stored. And so if you change the index values, your data should remain in the same form as it was before. And again, that goes back to why we want you to use the ZC display key property rather than the actual index or the sort order value. And so for people who may be more familiar with iForm Builder and who've been around a little bit longer and work with the classic builder, I know that that was one of the things that we highlighted, was to be very careful about the order of your option list because it could mess up the data that you collect. But since then, we've made enhancements, and with this new form builder, one of the nice things about it was the ability to change the order of the options, and with that, we also changed what was stored. So now you're getting your key values, which are going to be the value and the data that's stored behind the scenes.
All right, great, John. So let's see, we have only 64% of people who have voted, so I'll ask you one more question in hopes that we'll get more votes in.
Okay.
So there's the question, can you use that search for several values or in an if statement?
Yeah, you can use the search for several values. You can also use it within an if statement. What I will say for that is you want to be careful about your smart controls getting a little bit too complex, right? What may be a better solution in those cases is to actually write a custom function in the page level JavaScript, because one is going to give you a larger space to write in the page level JavaScript editor. The other nice thing is when you start writing those more robust functions, you're able to then apply it to different elements if you want as well. So you can actually save yourself some time in the long run, and it's going to be easier to develop in the initial time as well.
Great. And actually, another great question came in that I think would be really helpful for everyone to listen to. This is from one of our longtime users. They're asking, how do you prevent iForm from caching multi-select values? The issue on a subform for one of the forms that he has, and when you go to the next subform, all the multi-select values are still selected, and you have to unselect them to enter to then update your response in the form.
That's a good question. So, and Barrett, you may have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is you can set the dynamic value equal to -1, which would effectively mean that there is no options chosen. I'm also wondering if you can actually use that technique that we showed earlier with the full structure, including the form name, and then in this case, it would be the subform element and moving down through the tree. I actually haven't tried it personally, so I can't speak with certainty on it, but my guess would be because that prevents the caching of elements, that would work as well.
And I think we'll have to look into this a little bit more too, because multi-select option list shouldn't be caching responses. Mm-hmm. And so there could be something else in the JavaScript statements that may be caching those responses. And but I think both of what John said, both things will be helpful, and we'll look into it a little bit more. Yeah. Thank you, and John, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So let's move on to our third technique, and this is going to be showing an element only for a specific set of users. Now, for this example, I can really use any element I want. So let's go ahead and make this a signature element. Regardless of which type the element is, we're going to be able to do the same thing. I'm just going to call this admin only. Let's call this admin. That's the data column name. Now, in order to accomplish this, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating a page level JavaScript function to handle the logic involved with figuring out if I'm the proper user or not. So I'm going to open up the JavaScript editor, and again, let me do this a little bit slower. So in the upper right, I scrolled all the way up. These two curly braces are going to be the icon to add or edit page level JavaScript for this form. Now inside of here, and again, if you are not accustomed to working with JavaScript, this may be a little bit new for you. I'm going to talk through all the things that I'm doing, so hopefully it shouldn't be too hard to follow. Because I'm creating my own function, the first thing I need to do is state that I'm making a function. So I'm going to do that by using the word function. The next thing I'm going to do is name my function. So I'm going to call this check user. That name of my function is how I'm also going to initialize, or how I'm going to use my function later on within the smart controls. Now I'm writing out some syntax here to begin with, and this is something that I recommend whether you are new to JavaScript or you're experienced, but to try to write out as much of your syntax as possible because it will reduce the amount of errors you make later on. It's really easy to forget to put a curly brace at the end of your statement sometimes, so I always write mine first. Now inside of these parentheses are going to be what are called your parameters, or these are going to be values that I need for my function to work. In this case, because I want to check the username who's currently logged in, I'm going to create a variable called username. And so when I call my function later on, whatever value I use when I call the function will be stored to that variable called username. Inside of my function, I'm going to need a second variable. So I'm going to use the word var to declare that I'm creating a variable, valid users. Now what this variable is going to be is it's actually going to be a list or an array of the usernames who are allowed to see the element. Now, the username who I'm currently logged into my iPad with is called webinar. I'm just letting you know that now. What I'm going to do originally is I'm going to use a different username in this list. So when I'm done writing the function and I set up everything and I sync, I should not be able to see the element. So that's the behavior we're going to be looking for. Then what I'll do is I'll come back in here, edit my list, and then it should show up. After I have this set, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write a statement. It's called an if statement. And basically what I want this to do is if the username who's logged in is found in the list, then I want this to return the word true, meaning that it was found. Otherwise, or else, it will return the word false, meaning it was not found. Now the statement inside of here is going to be very similar to what I used for the multi-select. So I'm going to use the variable name, valid users, dot index of, and I'm going to use the username that I supplied here. So the idea with this line is I'm going to check to see if the username is an index of, or if it belongs to the array called valid users. So basically, if this value is inside of this list, then this will be true, meaning I will return the word true. Otherwise, I would return the word false. I'm going to go ahead and save this, close this. And now what I need to do is I need to use that function. So underneath here, I'm actually going to create another text field. And this text field is going to be used to keep track of the return of my function. So I'm going to go ahead and call this something like is valid user. And for my dynamic value, I'm going to go ahead and call my function, check user. Now again, I want to pass the person who's logged in currently. And to do that, I'm going to be using one of the iForm Builder built-in functions, iFormBuilder.username. Let me go ahead and save my form. And I'm going to sync this and check. And while I do that, Barrett, have any questions come up so far? I know that what I just went over could be a little confusing.
Not yet, but I will let you know.
Awesome. So let's jump back over here. Let's take a look at this webinar demo. And you'll see here, this is shown currently. Oh, that's interesting. It should not have been shown. That is not the intended behavior. I'm wondering if I logged in with this name actually. I may have logged in with my other name. Let's try this. Although it had to have been this name.
Is this statement supposed to have something in the dynamic value and in the condition value?
Well, so what I'm doing right now is I'm just checking the return of the function. This should have returned false. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the condition value afterwards on top of it. Let me try this one more time. The other thing I'm wondering if it's using a cached value from before when I had logged in. So I may need to clear the local database and check again. Oh, there we go. So now it's showing as false. So I guess I did log in with my other username. So you'll see it says false, meaning that this function did not find the username I was logged in as. So it did not find this one here. So now what I can actually do is I can go ahead and add the next one. Save this. And so this becomes a list of usernames who you want to be able to access that field for. And for my condition value here, I will set this equal to is valid user. The data column name of this text field is equal to true. And then again with this one, because this is really only used just for the manipulation of the smart controls, I'll set this to false so it's hidden always. Go ahead and save that. Let me jump back over here, resync, and let's check this out.
And John, one question that just came up is right now you're doing this scenario for one username. They want to see how you would change the syntax for multiple usernames.
Where if I wanted to allow multiple usernames to be able to access this?
Yes.
All I would have to do is continue adding them to this list, right? So if I wanted another username, I would just add them to this list continually. And basically what's happening is this function index of is going to take this value and it's going to look through each one of these and it's going to look for a match.
Great, thank you.
No problem. And I actually think I just realized what I messed up here. I had this backwards, so I forgot to add the index of, just like that search function is going to return the position of the value if it's found. So I actually need to set this equal to is not equal to -1. That's what I missed earlier. So if it does not find a match, then this would be -1. If it does find a match, it will return the index. It will return 0 or 1 and so on. So that this would then be true, not being -1. So I had just made a mistake in my JavaScript. I apologize for that. But now let's go back and check this one last time. So I will open this up. And this admin only field is shown now properly. And so if I just click in here, and then this is my signature element. So I'm able to sign this. But I do want to show you quickly that I am logged in as this username webinar. The reason it didn't show up earlier was just because I had messed up on my JavaScript. So you can see it's very easy to mess something up like this, which is why it's good to check and to do revisions and to make sure that everything is functioning in small increments.
So John, I just launched the poll to get everyone's response on this technique before you jump into the next one.
Perfect.
And we'll wait for a couple more people to respond, and then I'll close the poll. People seem very, very happy with learning this one as well and find it very useful.
Awesome. Yeah, I really like this one. I think this one is extremely useful.
Okay, so I'll close the poll now, and the floor is yours again.
Perfect. So we'll move on to our very last technique that we're going to be going over, and this is going to be capturing the number of subform records and using that within the conditional value. So I'm going to go ahead and add a subform to my form. Let me go ahead and call it something like subform records. And then I'm just going to go ahead and call this subform 1. Let me go ahead and copy this because I know I'm going to need it later. Now with a subform, just like with an option-based element, I have to now attach my form that is going to be loaded when I bring up this subform. I'm just going to choose one here. I think I chose this one. It's the one I had made before. Go ahead and save this. Now, just like with all the other examples we've done so far, I'm again going to make a second element that's going to keep track of the length. I'm going to make this a number element. Let's call this subform length. And for my dynamic value, I want to capture how many records have been added to the subform. So I'm going to use the name of my form, demo1, dot, the name of the data column here, so my data column name for this element, subform1, dot length. So again, this is form name, element data column name, and then the length property. Let me go ahead and save this. We will resync and take a look. Okay. So you'll see here currently the subform length is equal to 0. Now what I do want to note is actually the subform, in terms of it being a record, doesn't actually exist right now. That's one of the nice things about using a number element specifically for this use case, is because there's no value there, the number element is going to default to a 0. You'll see if I open up the subform and then I go back. If I do something like that, on Android devices, it'll show a 0, meaning that there's no actual records involved, but because I initiated the form, then you would get that number. So I do want to note that when you do this, that's one of the reasons I use a number field specifically, so that it shows it this way. So you'll see I currently have one subform record, and this actually isn't updating. I'm wondering if I have a typo in here. Let me just check one last time. It looks like I may have a typo. Oh, you know what I did? I know what I did. I overlooked a very, very basic property. In my subform, the link mode, you're able to set this to either multiple or single, and this is what I had forgotten. So if it's set to single, it will only allow you to have one record, and so it's not going to give you that length property. If I set this to multiple, that's what I need in order to make this work. And so while I'm thinking here, Barrett, any questions that have come up so far?
No, but I do want to reiterate that there was a question about having access to the page-level JavaScript and the forms. And for everyone who's attending, as well as anyone who's unable to attend or was unable to attend today, this session is being recorded, and John will share a form package from today's session in our recording webpage. In the next 48 hours, you will receive an email sending you that link so that you'll have access to it right away.
Yep. And now I'm able to add multiple records. It looks like it's still not linking properly with the dynamic value, so let me go ahead and double check that real quick. But I just want to make sure that this functions properly. Okay, so I'm getting my multiple subform records. I need to look at this subform length down below. So let's go back and check this. And I'm wondering if I have one of the values wrong here. So this is the data column name for my subform. That's correct. That's what it is. My form name was wrong. So I was missing the underscore here. I don't know about your experiences, Barrett, but I know for me, anytime I'm doing some sort of form builder or anything like this, it always seems to be the small mistakes that get you.
Right, and I do want to remind those individuals participating, one quick way to see the form name is actually at the very bottom of the screen. You could see where it says demo_1 and then the form label. So John did go to the edit form properties page, but he could have also just copied it from the bottom section of the form builder.
Yeah, and that's right here, in case anyone's not sure what Barrett was talking about. I'm kind of used to the old form builder as well, and so I always forget that this is here. But yeah, this would have been much easier for me to use. So let me go back over here. Let's resync this and let's try one more time. Start a new record. Subform length is 0, which is good so far. Let's add this here, and now we see that number is updating properly. I have a 1, and then a 2, and that's good. So now that we know everything is working properly, let's go ahead and add in our condition value statements. And so what I want to have happen is, with the subform, after I get to 3 records, let's have this not show up anymore. So for my condition value, subform length, which is the data column name for this field, has to be less than 3. Okay? So once I enter in that 3rd record, this should no longer be shown. Let me go ahead and save this. Resync. And we will add 1 record. Second record. And our 3rd record, and now the subform is not visible anymore. Now, this may not necessarily be super applicable in terms of hiding the subform, but I do want to highlight that it's really more of the act of accessing the length that I really want to communicate to you all. You may want to have things set up like a validation where a certain number, the subform length has to match a number that was shown previously in the form. Anything like that, but the syntax is going to be very similar. It's just a matter of which smart control you use, whether you're setting the value, hiding the element, or using it as a condition. Okay, Barrett, were there any questions about this last technique I just went over?
So you did quickly kind of go through the link mode. So I did mention it to this individual who had the question. But they were confused. Not only did you uncheck single, but you also unchecked separate view.
Oh yeah.
So I shared with them that the link mode had to be set to multiple, but they wanted to double check that they could still use separate view if they wanted to.
Yeah. So you can use separate view or not use it. That's not going to impact the way the smart control works. The reason I unchecked separate view is because I wanted those subform records to show underneath. It's not showing anymore, but let me go ahead and close out of this and show you what I mean. So with separate view disabled, then what happens is each time I fill out a record, that record shows underneath in line with the parent form. If I had had separate view enabled, this would show in its own separate window. Now, both of those have pros and cons to them. Specifically for the case of this webinar, I wanted it turned off so that I returned back to the parent form screen every time I filled in a record. So you could see immediately that after that 3rd record was submitted, that the element was no longer shown.
All right, John, would you like me to go ahead and launch the 4th poll for feedback on this technique?
Yes, please.
Great. So now, if everyone could respond and share your thoughts on this technique, that would be great. And once we have most of the responses, then I'll close the poll. All right, so it looks like most people did respond, John, and people are finding it very helpful. And I think we went 100% with people finding it at least, or every technique at least somewhat useful. So that's great.
Very cool. Awesome. So let me go ahead and recap real quickly. We went over a lot of stuff today, actually, in a pretty short amount of time. So the 4 different condition values we talked about, condition value techniques we talked about, were 1, hiding a filled-in element. So meaning once an element has a value, it's then hidden. If you recall, we added the improved user experience where we then swapped in a read-only element instead of that text element. The second technique was displaying an other element for a pick list or for a multi-select, or if that's one of the options you have, you want the user to be able to fill in whatever that other value is going to be. So you have that text element shown conditionally there. The third technique revolved around whitelisting, meaning you're explicitly stating these users who are allowed access to an element. So we used a page level JavaScript function. We added those users to a list, and that if they are on the list, then they're able to see the element. If they are not on the list, the element is hidden from them. We used a signature element for the purposes of the demo. However, I do want to note that if you wanted to do something like use a subform, you're actually really able to have an entire separate section of a form only for those users as well. So that's going to give you a lot of flexibility and a lot of power. And then the final technique we talked about was setting conditions using the length of a subform. So the number of records that have been filled in a subform. Couple of things I wanted to note was that when I added the subform, I had to go back and set the link mode to multiple. And then also whether the separate view was turned on or off did not impact the functionality. The syntax was using the table name followed by the data column name and then the property length. Now, what I showed you today is really just the tip of the iceberg. I introduced a couple of different techniques for your smart controls and for your condition values that hopefully, and judging by the polls, are applicable to your own projects. But just know that it's really understanding the structure and the syntax of what you're able to do. From here, it's going to be a matter of being creative with your form building and extending this knowledge further. Now, when you do that, naturally, there are going to be some stumbling blocks, and I do want to let everyone on this webinar know that we're here for you and that there are a lot of support options at your disposal. To start off with, we can talk about our Customer Success Center. That is going to be probably your first stop whenever you're trying to learn a new topic, or if you're having trouble implementing something, you're able to go through our knowledge base where we have a lot of different articles on how to do different techniques and how to use the different elements in your form building. There's also an option for chat where during certain hours of the day we are available. I know I'm on chat sometimes, and so you're getting a person who's able to help you with the problems that you may have. Moving to the left, we have our community, which is also actually part of the Customer Success Center. Oh, sorry, Barrett.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, I know you're going to talk about the community briefly, but we are getting a little over our time here.
Okay.
But I'm going to put a link to our feature frenzy that's happening right now in the community right now for the feature requests. So if anyone has any questions about that, or if you don't mind explaining it a little bit, I think that would be great.
Sure. So the feature frenzy is our way of interacting with the community and helping you all direct what we produce and what we enhance with the form building, so that the work we do is really going to benefit the users who are using the platform. Basically what happens is, in this case, we have 4 different enhancements that we could potentially add to the platform, and you all are able to actually go on there and vote for the enhancements that you want to be seen. And so not only for yourself, but if you can get everyone in your organization who has an account or wants to create an account on the Customer Success Center, go on there and vote for what you want to see in the software, what you want to see added to it. And then if your choice is the winner of the feature frenzy, then that is what we will focus on with our development team. The last thing I'll talk about, because I do know we are running over time a bit, is the webinars. So just continue to tune into these webinars. At the end of this webinar, you're going to be receiving a survey about the content and the presentation. There's also going to be a question at the end of it. asking you to recommend a topic or topics for future webinars. We really want to make sure that these are a good use of your time and these are going to benefit you in everything you're trying to do with your projects and to bring extra value to the platform. And so if there are certain topics that you would like to learn about or you'd like me or Barrett to go over in more depth, definitely let us know and we'll do our best to include those in future webinars as well. Barrett, are there any last questions before I close out this webinar?
No, I think all the questions were asked, and thank you, John, for doing a wonderful webinar, and thank everyone who's on today's call for attending, and thank you for all those great questions and being an active participant.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. And again, in the next 48 hours, you're going to get a recording of the webinar, copy of these slides, and then also the form packages for what I went through today. Other than that, my email address is at the bottom. If you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me. And I hope you tune into our next webinar and sign up for it, which is going to be Building Solutions with Zerion, like Barrett said. It's a 3-part series that's going to be going through building out using the Zerion web services. And that will be on February 14th, 15th, and 16th. All right. Everyone have a good rest of the day. And I hope you learned something from this webinar. And good luck with your future form building.